why don't we get started here? The dean's discussions at the Kennedy School are designed to let us have community-wide discussions on topics of the day, guided by experts in our midst, in particular experts from our faculty. Each semester we picked a different theme. The theme for the discussions this fall has been different ways of achieving social change. Different approaches that I know our students are interested in learning about, that our faculty and staff are working on. So we had a discussion about achieving social change through the private sector. We had a discussion about achieving social change through governments. Of course, we are the Kennedy School of Government. That's the traditional method of change. Here's somebody with a fair amount of background noise. If everybody who's not talking right now, could mute, that would, thank you. And this discussion today is about social change through public organizing and social movements. And we are fortunate to have three terrific members of our faculty who are going to lead off this discussion under the moderation of Sarah Wald. So let me introduce these folks very, very briefly, because you've come to hear from them, not from me. And I've come to hear from them, not from me. We have Arthur Brooks. Arthur is a professor of the practice of public leadership at the Kennedy School. He is also the Arthur Patterson Faculty Fellow at Harvard Business School. Joined our faculty a couple of years ago after a decade or so as the president of the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, a think tank he led very effectively for a decade. Erica Chenoweth is the Berthold Beitz Professor in Human Rights and International Affairs at the Kennedy School. She's also the Susan and Kenneth Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Erica came to the Kennedy School maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. Her research and her practice in the world and her teaching focus on political violence and alternatives, in particular, the ways that nonviolent movements can have very profound effects in the world. And Marshall Ganz is the Rita Hauser Senior Lecturer in Leadership, Organizing, and Civil Society. He's been at the Kennedy School for longer than Arthur or Erica or me, and has taught many students at the school and literally tens of thousands of students remotely. So he was ready for this year long before most of us were. I'm very grateful to Marshall and Erica and Arthur for joining us today. Discussion will be moderated by Sarah Wald, who is my chief of staff and an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Law School. And I will just turn the microphone over to Sarah. Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you, Doug, and thanks everybody for coming. The format is going to be the usual for the main discussions, which is each of our three panelists will talk briefly about their own work and their own perspective on this issue. Then we'll open it up to questions and discussion from the audience. If you will use the virtual hand raise, please, then we will call on you. If you prefer, you can write a question in the chat if that's easier for you, and we'll try to get to that too. So first, we're going to hear we are very lucky to have these three panelists who are experts on social movements and organizing, both from their research and academic work and from personal experience. So we are going to hear their perspectives, which in places differ and are useful. First, we're going to hear from Arthur Brooks, who's going to talk a little bit about his work looking at social entrepreneurs and how social movements get created and what they need to scale up. So Arthur.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. I think that the noise that you heard before was actually coming from my end because my neighbors are running a wood chipper. Again, one of the wonderful things about the coronavirus epidemic is that we get to share in that kind of disturbance. But I appreciate your forbearance, and this won't be a wood chipper of a discussion. I want to talk a little bit about social entrepreneurship because that's what I teach. It's what I'm fascinated with. I'm sort of obsessed with social entrepreneurs. and I have been for the longest time. Entrepreneurs are, members of American society and all societies, as a matter of fact, particularly creative, risk-taking social entrepreneurs in particular have a difficult product that they need to promote. And especially so when it's in the world of ideas and even controversial ideas. So I want to talk a little bit about what my research has found and how I've discussed it with people that are trying to enact social change. One of whom is actually on this call. I just noticed that Diego Garcia Bloom, who's the leader of the Student Association at the Harvard Kennedy School, is here. And he and I have talked about this a great deal and come to a real meeting of the minds for his work and activism. So one of the things that is really interesting about writing about social entrepreneurship is not that it's any specific nonprofit area. I mean, there are social entrepreneurs in health and education and poverty relief, and I've written a textbook on that subject. But what's interesting is the difference between successful and unsuccessful social entrepreneurs. The successful ones, they provide a service, which is sort of the supply of what they do, whatever they're trying to enact, but they also stimulate demand. And the reason for that is that there's this hurdle that social entrepreneurs have to cross, which is that they have an idea of something that we need, but ordinarily we don't know we need it. And so when you're trying to create real social change, the whole idea is to help people think differently. I have a great new concept for a school. Well, you need to think differently about schools so that you will support this. I have a great idea for a cleaner environment. Well, I got to convince you that a cleaner environment is something that we need. Or the canonical example of a social entrepreneur is a missionary. You need a new religion. Well, I really, really need you to think differently if that's the case. The problem is that people don't agree on fundamentals. There's a lot of resistance to change. So stimulating demand to get people to think differently can be really hard. People love the status quo in their own thinking. They have a tremendous amount of my side bias or confirmation bias. People resist thinking in a new way about old problems. That's the state of nature. That's kind of how we're wired. So when I look at successful social movements, I'm looking at successful social entrepreneurs who are good at helping people to change how they think. And in so doing, I find that there's basically three fundamental truths. Now, my remarks are not going to go more than 5 minutes, so I'm not going to go into great detail about these things. But I will tell you that what I found, number one, is that the ultimate goal for really successful social entrepreneurs is almost always persuasion, not coercion. Now, I know that two Dean's discussions before this have been about social change through the private sector and social change through the government. The government has unique tools for coercion, is encouraging people to do or requiring people to do things that they don't want to do, that we have decided as a society that they should or shouldn't do. And that the private sector is really good at negotiation. Let's work out a deal with prices, for example, and products, right? Well, the truth of the matter is that in any human society, we have some range of three tools when people disagree. We have coercion, we have negotiation, and we have persuasion. What's left in the hands of the social reformers, of the people that are trying to start social movements? And the answer is not really very much coercion. I mean, sure, protests and boycotts can occur, but for real long-term change, persuasion is where it's at. We need to help people think different. And that's by the way, that's not just a sort of a fact of the matter, it's also a practical argument. Coercion doesn't work very well in helping people think differently because nobody in history has ever been insulted into agreement. At least I never have been. I suspect that nobody else on this call has either. Now, what do we know about persuasion? This gets to sort of truth number two about successful social movements, which is to say successful social entrepreneurs. It is that persuasion is effective, most effective, when social entrepreneurs are fighting for something positive instead of just fighting against something negative. And there's a lot of research on this. And what the research talks about, the social psych research, is that you can get a lot of energy by emphasizing the negative, but you can't keep long-term energy except with a positive message of fighting for something. And there's a lot of brain science that goes into how primary emotions are very difficult to maintain because of a process called homeostasis. And I can go into that if anybody's interested. Sometimes that's just a question of framing, and an example of a social movement that ran into a problem and tried to solve it was Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. It says against in their name. And they found pretty quickly that the energy was dissipating when they were constantly fighting against something, because you can't keep people in this sort of state of agitation for very long. And so they needed to reframe what they were doing, despite their title, to be fighting, basically mothers fighting for the safety of children. And they were very successful in doing so despite their name. The third fundamental characteristic of social entrepreneurs leading social movements through persuasion who are successful is that they find that love is a more enduring force than fear. Now, the truth is, as most of us know on a moment's reflection, but also on studying the concept philosophically or psychologically, that love and fear are cognitive opposites. This is a truth that was revealed by everybody from Lao Tzu to St. John the Apostle. Perfect love drives out fear. People would think that hatred perhaps is the opposite of love. It's not. Hatred is downstream from fear. Fear produces hate, and that can create tremendous short-term energy, but it's a highly glycemic kind of energy. Once again, the tendency to go back to a cognitive or an emotional status quo means that we can't maintain it for very long. And if anybody wants an example of this, the problem that we're having right now with people unwilling or unable to continue to wear masks in the worst part of the coronavirus epidemic is the fact that the fear that people initially felt has dissipated, even though it's inappropriate, because we can't maintain it. Well, social entrepreneurs that are working by encouraging people to be afraid of something, they run into this all the time. Why are people wandering off and not paying attention to my cause anymore? It's because fear is hard to maintain. Love, once it gets a flywheel turning, can go on and get bigger. Love is harder to generate, and it starts slower, but it can be sustained over the long run. And thus it is the proper basis for a stable, successful social movement. So when I'm working with social entrepreneurs who want to enact real social change for important causes, who want people to think differently, I ask 3 goals. Is your goal to persuade? Number 2, is your message to fight for someone? And number 3, is the engine of your movement love? And if the answer isn't along the lines of what I've talked about now, then it's time to recalibrate to become a more successful social endeavor.
Thanks very much, Arthur. Next, we're going to hear from Marshall, who has his perspective on social movements, both from his years of teaching in this area and from personal experience. And so, Marshall.
Yeah, I'm going to take a bit of a different approach and suggest some ways of framing the question. And the first question to reframe is, what do we mean by social change? And do we assume that social change is good? Isn't it sometimes bad? In fact, isn't social change happening all the time? And isn't really the question, because sometimes we experience it as good, sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's good for some people, bad for other people. Rarely is it good for everyone at the same time, especially in the short run. And we can talk about things like climate change, the pandemic, economic change, cultural, all this stuff is happening right now. And we're in an extraordinary moment of change, of all kinds of change that's happening. So I want to suggest that the real question is, how do we respond to change? How do we respond to social change that is in fact happening? Like, for example, all the galloping inequality, economic inequality, that's a change that's happening. And the question is, how do we respond? Climate change is happening. The question is, how do we respond? And there seem to be different ways that we respond or can. There's lots of ways we can, but in the narrative work that we've been doing, we sort of worked out about four different responses. One, we can resist it. We can say, this change is not happening. I'm going to build walls and I'm just going to keep it from happening. We could use the example of immigration in the United States and say, okay, not happening. We're not going to accept this change. We're going to build a wall and stop it. Another end would be to say we embrace it. We act as if there is no past, there is now a new present. And we're inventing ourselves and everything from this point onward. Probably you see some of that in Silicon Valley. Often you can see it sometimes in radical revolutionary regimes that think they have to recraft the nature of human beings and human nature in order to make their project successful. And so what we're arguing is that there's two in between. One is how do we accommodate the change? In other words, how do we hang on to our old story, our ways of understanding the world and how it works, but we allow just enough to keep that old story going? Like, for example, the story that was told about assimilation in this country. Oh, we can have some immigrants, but you got to be just like me. It's an accommodation. It's like Edmund Burke said, change in order to conserve. On the other alternative is to say, okay, this change that's happening is a good thing. And so we're only going to hold on to the old story enough to be able to begin to tell a new one. That would be an example of that, might be multiculturalism, for example. So I think one thing is to look at the different ways in which we, in fact, respond to change. And because we respond differently, it depends a lot on who we are, where we are we experiencing this as good, bad, negative, whatever. It's almost inherent that there's going to be contention about it because we find ourselves in different places, different values with different interests. And so the contentiousness of periods of change goes with the territory. It's kind of how it works. And usually when we try to repress contention, then we wind up in a very problematic situation. Now, the way it plays out, from my point of view, it depends on many factors, but the most important factor shaping how it plays out is power. And power conceived of in three domains, at least. One, economic power. There's real economic power. There's the power to coerce economically and to construct. There's political power, the power of the state, the ways in which we can mobilize state power and law. And there's cultural power. I mean, you know, the lines we may draw between these people are worthy and these people are not, or this religion is good and this one is bad. Cultural power. Bourdieu, the sociologist, talks about cultural capital and economic capital and political capital, sort of different forms of understanding that. And they all overlap in different ways. None of these things are clear-cut. These are all lenses, just ways of looking at a pretty complex reality. Now, our institutions, the institutions we're operating in, create structural conditions that can facilitate or obstruct. They can fuel reactiveness to change or encourage responsiveness. In the US, the sort of the history of certainly of social movements is intimately related of social movements and parties and how they've interacted with each other, because change rarely occurs within responses to change, certain kinds of responses to change that differ from maintenance of the status quo to adapting to a new story rather than hanging on to an old one, rarely occur within government. They often occur outside in the form of social movements. And social movements then mobilize and sooner or later begin to have some impact because they want to affect structural conditions on parties, and in that way through politics. This has been Dan Schlossman has a terrific book called When Movements Anchor Parties that talks about this relationship. Sometimes the movement is rejected by the party, like the populists were in the late 19th century. Sometimes the movement transforms a party, like the movement Free Soil and abolitionist movements transformed the Republican Party and essentially took it over in the mid-19th century. Sometimes it influences the party, like the labor movement in the 1930s, or like the evangelical movement in the 1980s influenced the Republican Party. And sometimes it gets taken over by the party and actually becomes then more an instrument of the party. Again, it's not like any one of these is right, any of these are wrong, but it's a dynamic of change and continuity that's kind of built into our system, it seems. So the choices that we make then about how to respond to change really matter because so much is in flux. They often depend on the quality of leadership, on the motivational capacity, how much we care, how deep the values are that are at stake that we're ready to sacrifice for or not. Our strategic capacity, our capacity for creativity, for understanding how to leverage power in different ways, and our organizational capacity, to turn resources we have into the power that we need to actually realize our goals. There's certainly been a lot of examples of protests that never developed the organizational capacity to follow through. On the other hand, they may have impact in the short run of a certain kind, but I'm suggesting those three dimensions really matter. I've had the most experience in community organizing, in social movements, and in politics. And in these domains, the core question from my experience, the first question is, who are my people? In other words, who is my us? Who is the people with whom I am in relationship, with whom I engage to confront this question of how to respond to the change that we're experiencing? And then the second question is, what is their experience? Not like I've got a ready-made deal I'm going out there to sell. I'm going to listen. I'm going to do a lot of paying of attention. We've been doing some work on respect this semester in the public narrative class. Very interesting. When you kind of boil respect down, it seems to boil down to just three things: to feel heard, to feel seen, and to feel valued. It's pretty basic. And we tend to know when people are engaging with us respectfully and when we're not. And so I'd argue that respectful engagement is one of the fundamentals here. And that means learning how people experience what's happening. And thirdly, the question is then, how could they turn their resources that they have into the power they need in order to respond in a way that advances their values in the context of the change that's going on? And a lot of that comes up in social movements. It's kind of what they're doing. They're not just fads or fancy. They're intentional, they're purposeful, and they're often about rearranging power. Now, and I'll shut up here in just a moment. The promise of democracy is that of a largely nonviolent way to accommodate diverse perspectives, diverse responses, consider them and choose among them, but based on the effective political equality of the voice of every single person within our community, city, state, and the world. To the extent this doesn't exist, other forms of decision-making prevail. Perhaps coercive power, economic power, coercive power based on race, coercive power of the state, the way it's structured, based on gender. And in the US, we have a particular problem, and I just want to sort of work toward a conclusion. My belief is that we're in the midst of a democratic breakdown in this country right now. Daily, our government becomes less representative of the population. Institutions like the Senate make a mockery of what we might consider democracy. The Electoral College, we're all familiar with, first by the post-electoral districts, mean 51%, you get all the voice, 49%, you get zero voice. We have some very rigid, not to say sclerotic institutions that are moving us in an increasingly anti-democratic direction because the population is turning to the places, it's crazy that California gets two senators and Rhode Island gets two. What possible rationale is there to that? And so we experience the Senate as a very powerful, fundamentally unrepresentative body that's having a big influence on our politics. And so the monetization of voting. I mean, we've commodified voting. We're the only liberal democracy that makes no constraints on campaign spending. I'm not talking about where it comes from. I'm talking about how it's spent. So unless you got several million, you can't run for office. I mean, come on. We heard Jacinda yesterday talk about New Zealand, where it's 25,000. That's all you can spend on a campaign. guess what? Lots of people run for office and lots of people vote because it's an invitation to participate in the democratic process. And wealth inequality. The wealth inequality that's galloping here and around the world means that wealth then trumps voice. And so we've got a problem. And I think in the US, it's particularly brutal because of the history of slavery, which gives a whole racial dimension to a change that Tom Piketty actually describes very well in his new book of a sort of fundamental shift and abandonment of egalitarian politics by the educated classes. And we can talk more, but Piketty's book is really good. So I guess what I'm saying is we need to be clear about our values. We need to be clear who our people are. And we need to be clear about how to empower our valued response to the changes that we're in the midst of. It's not easy. It's not conflict-free. And I'd suggest that at this point, the most effective response to change has been that of resistance coming not from the left, but from the right, whether it's in the Trump version, the free market version, or a combination of both. And lastly, I'd urge everybody to watch Dave Chappelle, his 16-minute monologue on Saturday Night Live towards the end, I think is one of the most profound articulations of the challenge we have to get real about understanding each other at the basic levels of what gives us joy, what gives us pain, and what it takes to actually live and demonstrate respect in what we do.
Thank you, Marshall. Lots of insights from both you and Arthur that will make for some interesting discussion as we go forward. And thank you to both of you for giving us your thoughts and your experiences on what makes successful social movements. Erica has actually studied this at length and has done substantial research on what differentiates successful, particularly protest movements from non-successful ones. How can you actually tell whether they're successful? Can the movements themselves tell? And how should we continue to measure that? And first, I also want to make sure to give a shout out to the fabulous profile of Erica in the New Yorker recently. If you haven't read that, you have to read it, and it will make you proud to be affiliated with the Kennedy School. Erica.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and colleagues, and everyone who's joining the call today. It's always a privilege to be part of conversations like this, and I appreciate the way that it has been set up. And thanks to you, Dean Elmendorf, for convening these conversations in general. So I do want to talk a little bit about the reasons why I think that it's easy to underestimate the transformative power of social movements. And part of it, I think, is because in many respects, people don't have the same kind of terms of evaluation when they talk about whether a movement has been defeated, whether it has succeeded, or somewhere in between. And one useful way to think about this is in terms of the kind of immediate short-term outcomes or effects of a movement, the longer-term strategic outcomes of the movement, and then even potentially generational or intergenerational outcomes of a movement. And I think that often when people kind of undervalue a movement's legacy, it's because they think it failed to produce the intergenerational or strategic outcomes that it said it wanted or that its members were motivated by. But they fail to fully recognize a couple of other things, which is the way that the movements actually changed the conversation, the types of capacities that were created, as well as the impacts of participating in an inclusive process to really kind of accept the challenge of living out someone's own personal agency and trying to bring about the change they want to see. And what that can do for people and how that can transform people and their own sense of ownership and responsibility for their community. So when I talk about short-term effects, I'm talking about something that a lot of social movement scholars and sociologists and political scientists refer to as what they call process goals. And they call them process goals because they're things that unfold while the movement is underway, that might indicate that the movement is having real political, economic, social, and cultural effects. These can include a movement actually expanding its participation, a movement forging new alliances with unlikely partners, a movement decisively impacting levels of public support for its own policy agendas, as well as public sympathy and favorability for the main claimants of the movement. In some cases, capturing positive media attention can be a major source of power or possibility of expanding power for movements, because that alone means that they can often enter into a much more sustained public dialogue and really put forward and dramatize the types of issues they're trying to bring to the agenda. Placing new items on the public's agenda or rearranging the priorities of the public agenda can be a really important kind of short-term effect. And so can the ability to score electoral victories. So for example, convincing somebody who's running for office to adopt a certain platform in the manner that the Parkland students were able to essentially not only compel a number of women to run for office for the midterm elections in 2018, but also to commit to trying to put forward key gun control legislation when they went to office, is an example of how movements can have those kind of electoral impacts. In fact, movements can also expand the number of people willing to run for office by motivating them to take responsibility through public office. Movements can also, in the shorter term or medium term, develop important organizational capacities and infrastructures that even if they themselves aren't able to fully deploy, they lay the groundwork for the next generation to pick up and use to good effect. And another thing that happens for many movements, even if they don't achieve their fully stated aims, is that they might become kind of vessels of collective experience that others can learn from. This is true both through being able to inspire and motivate others by short-term successes or things done well as becoming cautionary tales where other people learn some negative lessons about what not to do. In fact, many activists who have been involved and organizers who've been involved in this type of work for a long period will have plenty of negative examples that they will be happy to share with those who come later. And even things like tactical innovations are really important midstream outputs of movements that then diffuse elsewhere where they are put to good use. A really concrete example of this was the Hong Kong uprising of June of 2019, which many people consider as a defeated movement today, but that innovated very interesting techniques to protect the population against tear gas. And one of the things that they did was, in addition to bringing umbrellas to protests and encouraging others to bring umbrellas to protests, they began to use construction cones to snuff out tear gas canisters before they could do harm to anybody. That particular tactical innovation then diffused to the United States, where it was used all across the country in the summer of 2020, where we witnessed the largest and broadest mass mobilization that the United States has ever experienced. And we saw people using construction cones all over the country to protect their compatriots in the streets from tear gas. So those are some of the short-term outputs of movements that are easy to ignore or maybe undervalue, but that all hold the seeds of further capacities for longer-term organizational transformation. And then, of course, we have longer-term strategic outcomes. These are things like actually achieving significant resource redistribution, actually achieving concrete policy changes or deterring policy changes from coming into effect, seizing power, seizing political power through electoral institutions or cultural or economic power, as Marshall has put it, are also things that we have seen as the direct result of major movements around the world. Everything from the abolition of slavery to the expansion of suffrage to everyone in the United States over the age of 18 who is not a felon starting in 1965. These are all the direct results of large-scale mass movements. So the second point I want to make is the point that success is never permanent. So as I mentioned, there's sort of the third intergenerational or longer term outcomes of movements. So we know from plenty of from research and political theory that that power is not permanent, that progress is something that requires constant vigilance against countervailing coalitions, and the legitimacy of a movement's claims, even once it has succeeded, have to be constantly replenished, just like the legitimacy of any power holder. And this is where many movements seem to taper off, because once they become comfortable with having transformed the status quo, they assume that everyone will be convinced by the wisdom of their claims, and that they no longer need to put pressure on power or protect against a countervailing coalition. And usually that's when they become surprised by a counter-revolution that comes roaring back and looks just like what they look like, except with more skill. So Asif Bayat, the well-known Iranian sociologist, has a quote that I think sums this up wonderfully. He says, "Nothing so much as revolution requires hope, inspires hope, and betrays hope." That said, my third major point is that it is often unfair when we judge a nonviolent movement or social movement's long-term impacts by what they failed to achieve, without fully appreciating what the counterfactual would have been if they had not existed in the first place. What might have happened if the movement hadn't tried anything? For example, the feminist social critic Rebecca Solnit, in her book Hope in the Dark, talks about a vignette in which, as many of you may be familiar, tens of millions of people rose up in February of 2003 to try to prevent the United States from invading Iraq. Now, of course, those tens of millions of people were extremely disappointed when such efforts were ignored and the United States invaded Iraq. But Solnit points out that there's some good evidence to suggest that that mobilization may have slightly delayed the invasion, that in fact, it demonstrated a level of resistance that was not expected by members of the Bush administration at the time, that they may have had to have further internal conversations about the wisdom of this, and that even a few days of time, of extra time, could allow journalists to go to Iraq, to be able to document what was about to happen, to witness the events, and that set up the opportunity for later accountability. It also gives time for people to flee. And so, again, even movements that seem to fail abjectly often do things that save lives or provide further opportunities for resistance later on. We can think of examples in the United States over the past few years, like the protests that spontaneously developed in January of 2017 in resistance to the Muslim ban at various airports, which delayed, for sure, the ability of the Trump administration to push forward its anti-immigrant policies to a large extent. A similar thing could be said about the protests against Obamacare in 2017 and the protests against family separation, which certainly demonstrated that there would indeed be political costs and that the world was watching. So in sum, I just want to say that it is true that social movements don't always have the kinds of effects that their participants would like to see, but almost no progressive change has ever taken place without one. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. I would ask that you use the virtual hand to raise your hand, and just remind you of what makes a good question at the Kennedy School. You first identify yourself. Second, it's brief and only one. And third, it ends in a question mark. So.
No questions, huh?
No questions. All right, I'm going to start out with a question that came up when we were, and maybe this will justify, when we were talking beforehand about this, which is that several examples were given of social movements which one or more of you suggested were only protest movements, and because they did not result in any either permanent change or permanent organizational structure, were failures. And the two examples that came up were Occupy and the Tea Party. I'd love you to talk about whether you think that is the case or if you think it's not the case.
Who are you calling?
I'm going to start with Arthur.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I think, Erica's point is incredibly well taken, that failure is not necessarily failure. And it's kind of blowing my mind right now because I'm thinking about all the cases in which I've taught in teaching nonprofit management, where we talk about the inability to endure and meet objectives that were stated as success objectives, but at the same time to achieve something realistic and important, notwithstanding. And so, I'm not I think the examples that I would typically give actually might not be as strong as I once thought. I think Erica's argument is really, really compelling. I often talk about how, the stated goals of the Tea Party movement in American politics, it was a strong movement at the beginning of the financial crisis. It never migrated beyond simply fighting against a certain set of policies. And not being able to migrate beyond fighting against something and trying to use some sort of coercion, and being one that's largely based on fear, that it actually didn't attain any of the characteristics that would give it a long-standing appeal. It wouldn't be able to migrate itself into a social movement. So protest movements are at the beginning of many social movements, but they become effective social movements when they take on these characteristics that I talked about before. But then I'd have to ask myself whether or not they did attain certain long-standing objectives, notwithstanding the fact that very few people are actually doing Tea Party demonstrations anymore. So that's an example of an organization that did not continue to exist, despite the fact that the founders thought that it would continue to exist for 50 years. It existed for more like, 2. But maybe there are long on tail effects that I'm not taking account of. So I'll kick that over to Erica and get her views on that, or Marshall.
Yeah, so I think that the Tea Party, it did have some important electoral effects. I'm pasting in the chat a paper that was done by Adam Modestam. Actually, it started as a HKS working paper. Where what they do is they kind of model the effects of the Tea Party protest, just a single day of protest in 2019, and they look at the correlations with support for GOP candidates in each congressional district in the 2010 midterm elections who committed to adopt Tea Party platforms. This research, I think, I see where Arthur is coming from. I mean, it's true that they didn't achieve their sort of full range of kind of libertarian agenda that they were putting forward, but I also think that they likely created a mini realignment within the Republican Party that was much more populist in its orientation and anti-establishment, and that that really opened the door and was sort of a proof of concept for a longer term disruption within the party. I also think if you look at Theda Skocpol and Vanessa Williamson's book on the Tea Party, one thing that's very clear about them is that they did kind of fizzle out in terms of their protest politics and electoral impacts in the short term, but they did a lot of community organizing and did a lot of takeovers of like school boards and local politics, and really focused on really the long game of seizing power through seizing power in multiple different local state institutions, and then being able to kind of see through with this longer term agenda through that approach. And I'm not sure, because I didn't do the research, how totally convincing that is, but it's an argument that suggests that there are other kind of indicators of success besides their sort of ultimate achievement of their goals. And I think on Occupy, what I'll say about this briefly is just that I think that the most important thing that Occupy did was it did convene a whole group of people together that essentially have been the primary activists and organizers of the last decade in American politics on the left. Like most of the people who became really influential in the Dreamer movement and Black Lives Matter and the kind of Democracy Spring area and a number of different kind of major progressive organizations that then have forged coalitions and been trying to kind of build this movement of movements are definitely alumni of what they call Occupy School and view their experience with Occupy as a negative experience in terms of their inability to transform into something that was more enduring. But it definitely built a new capacity that is difficult to ignore.
Yeah, I agree. No, but just quickly, yeah, Tea Party. You could look at the election of 2010 and say, did the Tea Party have any impact? Yeah, it had some impact. It sort of helped scotch the whole Obama agenda for the next 6 years. So I would say it had some impact in the ways that Erica described. As for Occupy, it put the whole economic inequality thing on the agenda. I think there's no question but that the Democratic candidates, including Obama, would not have taken the approach on wealth inequality and taxation and so forth had it not been for Occupy. And so I think Erica's right that it depends on what you mean by success. And there are many steps towards that. And so, you know, yeah, so we can evaluate success in many terms. Just one other thing I wanted to put out there was I think there's some enduring sort of fault lines in American politics that we return to again and again. One is about race, obviously, and another one is about gender. Another one is about class, although that has more ambiguity. And another one is about relationship to the natural world. And if you sort of go back to the beginnings, you'll see these fault lines. You know, there was the civil rights movement, now there's Black Lives Matter. There was the first women's movement, the second. These remain unresolved inequalities and tensions. And so they're going to continue to shift. And to Erica's point about, you know, it doesn't stay fixed. Yeah, it doesn't stay fixed as long as the tensions that are driving it aren't ultimately resolved. And that requires levels of change that we haven't been capable of so far.
Okay, we have a question from Miles Rapoport from the Ash Center. Miles, identify yourself and then ask your question, please.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Miles Rapoport. I'm the Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center. And my question is for any of the panelists, but it seems like we're about to have an extraordinary natural experiment in the relationship between seeking change by social movements and seeking change by government. Private sector probably too, but particularly government and the social movements. So if you were in the enviable position of being an Uber advisor to the social movements and to the incoming Biden administration and how to make the most social change out of it in this experiment, what would you tell the respective parties to do?
Pray? No.
Not enough, Marshall.
Right.
It's a really great question, Miles. And obviously people are really struggling with this. I think that on the left, there was expectation of a blue wave that didn't happen. And so I think that there was aspirations for structural change coming out of this election that are going to be very difficult to realize because of the politics that came out of the election. Now, what you do with that, I think, is a really good question. And I don't think it's an easy answer to it. You know, because, and actually to what I was saying at the beginning about do we accommodate change or do we adapt old ways of thinking to new? I think that's one of the points of contention, I think is, this whole Trump period was just a blip and we're going to go back to things as normal. We'll make a few adjustments. On the other hand, this revealed a deep problem in our democracy. And to go forward, we have to come up with a fresh way of looking at things and doing things. And I think those are different perspectives. And I think, unfortunately, within the Democratic Party, it's turned into a kind of, a contest, shall we say, that's, I don't think, very productive, because it misses the critical point, going back to what Arthur was saying about what are you for? And how do you define what you're for? And how do you mobilize around what you're for? And so I think there's a real question there in terms of, I don't think there's an easy answer. It's a really important question, Miles. I'd be curious what you think.
Arthur or Erica?
Go ahead, Erica.
Well, I was just going to say there's a really great piece by Mark Weisinger, who's a political scientist at Princeton, that is on what happened after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which by all accounts was one of the most diverse and popular kind of the color revolutions that had taken place. And he writes about his main puzzle in the piece is why the Orange Coalition dissolved after Yushchenko became president, and within 2 years left office as the least popular elected president in the history of elected presidents, with like 5% approval rating or something like that. And ultimately, Weisinger's point is exactly something that your question gets to, which is the hazards of the negative coalition. This is Arthur's point too, which is that when a coalition is formed to be against, without articulating a vision for the future that is appealing and attractive to actually expand the base, to win over people both in the center and some others that flip, then the coalition that will form to retake power will be much more united and disciplined than yours. And so to a certain extent, I think that's the problem we have in the United States right now, is that the group that's going to take power came on the heels of a negative coalition. And the politics of that negative coalition were not really negotiated during the course of the movement or the election that was kind of propelled by the movement. And so they're being negotiated now. And obviously it's ugly and will be ugly. But in terms of trying to create a kind of transformative structural change, I think Arthur's lessons are really important, and I hope he'll speak to them. But just this idea of the power of persuasion and, to the fullest extent possible, attracting people in and minimizing the use of coercion is the way to make it stick.
Yeah, thanks, Erica.
Arthur.
It's interesting that, Dan Goleman, our Harvard colleague Dan Goleman, has really wonderful work on different leadership models. And the least effective leadership model that he sees in corporate life is what he calls coercive leadership. And that's basically bullying leadership. And what he finds is that organizations can get into a bad cycle where they go back and forth between different bullies, and coalitions form around bullies. And the truth about, the social science literature on bullies is that nobody likes them. Even their followers don't like them. But if you have a choice between two bullies, you'll get behind your bully versus the other bully. But that's a suboptimal equilibrium. The game theory is really clear. It's like when even your bully gets knocked off, nobody's sorry, actually. And so I look at the data now, and the data say that something like 93% of Americans hate how divided we become as a country. Now, that's great news. The bad news is that 7% don't hate it, which is, in my own coinage, I call it the outrage industrial complex. This is it's the media and the activists and the politicians and the social media personalities who they want more fighting. They want more hatred. They want more fear. And they're driving the bus because people are lining up behind their own bullies. And so the advice that I give to people in either party who, they're not like, calling me up in the Democratic or Republican Party this week, it's basically grab the 93%. That's the new ethical populism, is actually, you don't have to at Christmas time hate your, right-wing Uncle Bill or left-wing Aunt Marge. You don't have to hate. We can do this without hating each other. And as a traditional historical matter, this is a message that 10 to 15 years after a financial crisis is what resolves a lot of the economic populism that's based on fear. 90% of people in the election that we just endured a few weeks ago, was it a few weeks ago? Yeah. Where 90% on either side said they were largely motivated by fear of the other side. I mean, come on. That's a huge entrepreneurial opportunity. When you walk into a situation and you see people motivated by negative action, you know that you have an opportunity to do something really, really good, and that people will thank you for it and people will actually follow you. So my advice to both sides is the same. Get there first. Get to the positive side first. Get to the 93% first. Get to love first.
I think that's a good aspiration. I think 93% saying that they hate the way things are so divisive. I would suspect that a good portion of that is what I hate is that the other side is being divisive, but my side is not. And so I would take that with a real grain of salt. I think that there are values conflicts here that are very real. There's fears that are very real. And I don't think that can be papered over. I think it has to be addressed. And addressing it is not going to be a simple matter. Addressing it's going to require some pretty deep kinds of engagement. I think 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. I mean, that's a fact. That's a challenge. From my perspective, that's a fundamental challenge to our democracy. Now, the question is, how is that engaged with? So, yeah, I think definitely you need to know what you're for. People don't organize around grievance, they organize around hope. Without hope, there's no, grievances abound, but hope is not certainty and hope is not light. Hope is, well, it's a sense of the possible and it's realistic. It's not fantasy.
Okay, anybody from the audience willing to engage at wanting questions?
It says 3 participants raised hands.
I think Noelle is next.
Okay, Noelle.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a great conversation. I am on staff at the Kennedy School, and something I've been really sort of enamored with lately is this movement within social movements in the United States with a real focus on healing. So by that I mean like personal healing, collective healing, and like emphasizing deep relationship over campaign to win style organizing. And some of these efforts that are going on around deep canvassing to kind of, how progressive folks connect with Trump voters. And I'm curious if these trends are something that you all are following, and if so, what your opinion is on the potential to address the huge division that we're seeing in the country right now.
Do you want to direct that to someone in particular or any of the panelists?
I'm guessing it's more of a Marshall Erica thing, but anyone's welcome.
Erica?
Yeah, Erica, you go ahead. I'll go ahead.
Well, as usual, I'll put a recommended book in the chat. This is by Kazu Haga, who's an amazing organizer, and he wrote a great book called it's about healing resistance, and it's basically on this idea of organizing around this concept of basically healing the original sins of the nation, developing a much broader constituency who'd be interested in this, and then mobilizing against injustice together. And I think that I've seen a couple of things that I think are interesting and novel in this time. The first is, like you've said, there is this resurrection of attempts to bridge civil society. We've had a pretty bonded civil society in the past 20 plus, maybe really 40 years, where to the extent that we've had civil society organizations, they've been very self-contained and talking amongst themselves rather than to one another. And another thing that we've had is a number of different, real concrete claims about things like the need for truth and reconciliation commissions and reparations that actually are gaining mainstream notice and attention for the first time in at least a generation in this country. And so that's another avenue through which these kind of initiatives are underway. So I think that these are all interesting. It remains to be seen how effective they will be. And part of the limitation on these types of initiatives is often that they are undertaken by those who volunteer. And so there is an element of really a danger of preaching to the already converted. And so that's just what these groups are really up against in terms of making it work the way they want to.
I think the deep canvassing that Dave Fleischer developed in LA in the wake of Prop 8. Prop 8 was in 2008 when Obama won, but the marriage equality initiative also won in California that outlawed marriage equality. And so their theory was to go to the neighborhoods, the precincts where they voted against the gay community. And instead of just going and canvassing and arguing about the issue, is to move to a relational engagement as soon as they could. In other words, to not let the interaction be defined by the difference, but to do the work to dig to where there might be values that were shared. And it's one of the problems of getting stuck in issues and not going to values, because values opens up pathways of connection. You know, people care about their kids. People care about, it's human beings care about a lot of the same things. And that's what sparked that whole deep canvassing deal, which is one of our former students has been leading an effort in Michigan called We the People, has been intentionally developing a multiracial organization in that state. And they've had a big impact there. But it's going deep. In other words, it's going beyond the surface, the shallow, the issues, to what people actually care about. And then you recontextualize the issue within a context of values. See, and so then the other person is not defined by the issue. The other person is a person, and the issue is understood in that context. Now, see, turning politics into marketing and turning voters into data points and all that goes in the opposite direction, because it's not seeing full human beings as full human beings. It's looking for indicators, brands by which we can predict their behavior or whatever. That's not the same thing. And that's why I agree. I think the deep canvassing is one of the very positive things that's come along, because it reasserts the significance of relationships, real relationships, not intimate kinship, but public civic relationships with one another. That's a lot of work to do that, rebuild that, because there's so much that militates against it. And so, yeah, it's really important. It's the sort of, again, I'm going back to that great political philosopher, Dave Chappelle, because I think at the end of that monologue, I think it's exactly what he was articulating, was exactly that. You got to go to the core values and then from there build, rather than letting it be defined by the differences. Because differences are real too. I mean, it's not like they're not. Sorry.
Next question, Doug Johnson, and then Diego after Doug. Hi, Doug.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Doug Johnson. I teach over at the Carr Center, Human Rights, and so forth. So I was struck by the fact that Arthur, who I still haven't had a chance to sit down with for a talk, was so much in agreement with Che Guevara about the centrality of love in organizing. And I'd like to affirm that. I believe it is what sustains us over time. And also, of course, as a longtime student of Marshall's, I believe in the necessity of a positive agenda. But at the same time, we now see groups that love themselves but don't love others, and that are in conflict with each other on values as well as on program. So I'm wondering if you could just reflect in this notion of finding new ways of making bridges about the need that social movements have for a defined adversary, and whether or not that adversary obviously can be dealt with respectfully, but social movements, and as Erica's research has shown it, social movements are successful when they undermine the power of specific adversaries. So how do we combine this problem of finding positive, love-oriented social movements that are nevertheless confronting power in the most strategic way?
Arthur, you were referenced, so I think it starts with you.
I guess we're following presidential debate rules here. If you say
Right.
my name, I get to talk. So it's an interesting question, and I think that we all have to, in social movements, and either starting as protest movements, but ultimately migrating into social movements to have enduring impact and longevity. You got to make a choice. I mean, indeed, Saul Alinsky wasn't wrong when he said you got to personalize. You got to personalize. You have to. I mean, it's like, you know, the political right has to say it's George Soros's fault, and the political left have to say no, it's Charles Koch's fault, and you have to personalize it around one guy, one person. And I realize because that brings a single point of pressure on the other side, but it also, it magnifies, like a magnifying glass, you know, burning through a leaf when you were a kid, when you do that. But you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice whether that's within the framework of your moral objectives. You know, our great colleague, Bob Putnam, talks about this really, really eloquently. And you know, Erica talked about the, you know, the bondedness that we have, but and that language comes from bonding and bridging social capital, from Coleman and Granovetter, and of course, Bob Putnam. And, you know, the literature on social capital says there's two kinds of social capital. Number one is bonding social capital, which we have in incredible abundance. Right now, the idea is like, you're on my team or you're on their team. That is pure bonding social capital language. And that's the problem. That is the problem that we have in American society today, because what we really need and what great leadership does, I mean, great leadership is not about building a bonding social capital, but bridging social capital, which basically says not my team, their team, my identity, their identity. It's our common story. It's moving from identity to story. And the common story is to say, I'm going to build bridges. So to speak directly to the question that we were just answering and to tie them to the two things together, the work that I've been doing over the past 5 years with the Dalai Lama is exactly trying to get people to share common stories about their loves. In other words, you get people together, you want to get a left-wing and a right-wing voter together, and you don't want them to scream at each other about the minutia of corporate tax rates or something that's just nothing more than a proxy argument for something cultural. You have them start by talking about their shared problems they have with their teenage kids. Then they will bond over, that's the common enemy, by the way. You can tell I've had a lot of teenagers. You know, that is something, shared loves is what will create the bridge, because that's the common story of our sisterhood and brotherhood and walking on earth. So that's how I see it. You've got to make a choice. Are you going to personalize the ultimate evil, the enemy? Are you going to say that is evil? We must hate that. That's the secret to getting good bonding social capital. But it's not the secret to an enduring legacy of high quality moral leadership that can elevate, aspire, and create opportunity among diverse groups of people, which is the essence, as far as I'm concerned, of what we're trying to do as leaders. So I say, yeah, it works. And yeah, don't do it.
What about when their interests are in fundamental conflict? What about when the power is so unequal?
Yeah, I understand, Marshall, but in a pluralistic society where there's a competition of ideas, we can have totally orthogonal values and live together perpetually in peace.
If we have some kind of relative equality.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're trying to do as a democratic pluralistic society, is to create more balance and power.
But we're going the opposite direction, Arthur.
That's a different problem. What I'm saying is in the ideal.
It's a core problem. it's a core problem, because without addressing that problem, it's very hard, it seems to me, to imagine how to get to what the very desirable thing that you're describing.
But personalizing evil is not the answer.
Alinsky also said that organizers have to be well-integrated schizoids, because you have to polarize to mobilize, you have to depolarize to settle.
Well, I'm well aware of that argument.
This is such an interesting discussion. We could probably go on for hours on this. I want to make sure we have time for one more question from a student, Diego.
Hi, my question is very related, so I'm sorry about that. But
no, that's okay.
One thing that has really sat with me after this election, I'm Diego Garcia Bloom. I'm an MPP 2 student at the Kennedy School. This past election, I was really involved with mobilizing LGBTQ voters and Latinx voters. And our theory of change in our groups was really pushing the media and other groups to call what President Trump was doing outright racist. And we did get those headlines in the New York Times, and we celebrated them. And our theory of change was that when it was made that stark and clear, it would be a blue wave, because people would really choose a side of what was being perceived as not racist. Now, I actually feel we're more divided than ever before, because in 2016, you could chalk it up to giving this guy a chance. Now we've seen 4 years of it, it's been defined. I've seen even my friend groups from infancy break up because people voted for a certain person and attributing those attributes to that. And I think groups that I work with are even more convinced that people who may have voted for Trump are just buying into racism. So, but there's still 76 million people that did that. My question for you all is, how do we then how do we reach out to Trump voters? How do we start figuring out, besides saying you saw this racism and you still voted for it, you are racist? And I think that's where a lot of people are, and that's the gut reaction, because that was a theory of change that didn't pan out. How do we start unpacking that into actually understanding that there are multiple forces at play? People can be swayed to one side or the other, but we keep being pulled to the extremes more and more. So I think my question is about messaging and outreach across the aisle.
Well,
Erica.
yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit to this and the previous question together. I mean, I think one of the really important things for me anyway is to remember that I can never assume what it is that's motivating somebody based on how they look, what they wear, where they work, or what I think of them. And in fact, one of the most powerful lessons that came through with a conversation I was having with James Lawson, who was kind of a powerhouse figure in the Nashville campaign of the civil rights movement, was that talking one-on-one to people reveals much more about what's going on with them and what they care about. And like Marshall and Arthur have been saying, values-based conversations are much more revelatory than in the types of conversations I'm more kind of are more my instinct, which is an interrogation, And so what Reverend Lawson, his story is that he was basically sent to Nashville to desegregate it in the late 1950s by more sort of national civil rights figures. And, the idea was, okay, let's go to Nashville and kind of rejuvenate these bus boycotts and marches and things like that. And he took a different approach. He called it the one-on-one work. He took an entire year to meet one-on-one with people in their homes and ask them what was going on with them. And what happened as an outgrowth of that, what he called one-on-one work, was that he mostly talked with women, Black women, who were home during the day. And he came across a very common story, which was that their biggest indignity that they faced was that their children were not wearing clothes that fit them or shoes that fit them, because they were not allowed to try on clothes in the department store. And if they brought them home and they didn't fit, they weren't allowed to return them. He heard that story so many times that he realized this community needs the department stores desegregated. And we need to come up with a campaign that will achieve that outcome and they will participate in. And so they prepared for months to do a department store desegregation campaign that started with boycotting downtown businesses that were still segregated and having lunch counter sit-ins that disrupted the downtown area such that nobody wanted to go shop there. And they were able to actually desegregate Nashville within 6 months. And this is a really important point, that when they did so, they constantly messaged that they don't want to hurt anybody because they didn't think that would do any good. But they were inviting the entire society into being part of the movement to do what was right. And movements don't win because they do what's right, but they do win when they have a compelling invitation into a campaign that is rooted in people's lived experience where they live. And so they had a Black-led multiracial movement that was highly successful. And this really reminds me of feminist approaches to dealing in social change. And one of the people that comes to mind is Barbara Deming, who was a radical lesbian feminist, activist, and pacifist, who developed a framework that she called the 2 hands of nonviolence. One hand is holding up a resistance to injustice and saying, no, we will not let you hurt us and we will not let you hurt the people we love. But the other hand is open, an invitation to come and be part of this movement. You are welcome here to help us be part of the change that will make everybody in the society more free. And so there's a lot of really good thinking and experience in these arts that do have a lot of potential and possibility. They might sound idealistic, but like I said, what else do we have at this point?
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and this has been such an insightful conversation. Obviously, lots to continue to talk about. I would like to thank if we could give both a virtual and a real applause to our wonderful faculty panelists, Erica Chenoweth, Marshall Ganz, and Arthur Brooks. And now you all know them virtually, so you can continue the conversations both virtually and in real life, hopefully soon. So thank you so much to all of you, everyone, all the students. Good luck on your exams and finishing up the term, and everyone stay safe, and we'll see you soon.